December 7th, 1941, 05:11 a.m., North Pacific, 230 miles north of Oahu. The wind tore across the steel deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, carrying with it the sharp scent of salt, oil, and cold metal. In the dim, bluish half-light before dawn, the entire ship felt like a single living machine awakening for the strike it had been built to deliver. Aircraft engines coughed, roared, and settled into a deep mechanical growl. Sailors sprinted between tie-downs, shouted clipped commands, and signaled through the swirling haze of exhaust. Above this swirling chaos stood Lieutenant Nagata Kyōshi, his coat pulled tight against the freezing air, watching the first wave of attack aircraft being rolled into position with a heaviness in his chest he couldn't quite explain. He had spent the night reviewing the final intelligence packets, tallies of American ships, aircraft listings, logistics estimates, personnel projections. The numbers fit together with unnerving precision, like a puzzle completed too easily. He had memorized every chart the General Staff had prepared, yet something in them had left him unsettled, not because of what was included, but because of what might have been missing. Now, on this trembling deck, with the entire strike force moving like a rehearsed ritual around him, that faint unease settled deeper, as if carried in the icy mist that clung to the ship's railings. Nearby, flight commanders barked last-minute corrections, mechanics wiped frost from canopies. Young pilots, some barely 20, walked with grave, almost ceremonial composure, their breath turning to white vapor as they tightened straps and checked their maps one last time. They believed absolutely in the plan, that America would take the blow, stagger, and remain crippled for years, that their own empire, striking with speed and precision, could dictate the tempo of the coming war. These were the promises delivered by admirals, strategists, and intelligence officers who claimed to understand the United States through the cold clarity of numbers. But Nagata felt no such clarity, only a growing weight behind his ribs, a sense that the picture had been drawn too narrowly, that the enemy on those sheets of paper was somehow smaller than the enemy that truly existed across the ocean. He kept his expression still. Doubt was not a luxury afforded to junior officers, especially those working with intelligence summaries already approved by Tokyo. But the tension in the air, the trembling metal beneath his boots, the distant roll of engines cutting through the darkness, all of it sharpened his instincts rather than quieting them. Something in the American equation was wrong. He could feel it as surely as the cold against his skin. The final Zero fighter launched with a burst of flame and thunder, rising into the pale sky like an arrow vanishing into fog. The deck fell briefly quiet, except for the rumble of the ship cutting through the waves. Nagata watched the shrinking silhouette and felt the sudden certainty that something far greater than an attack was now unfolding, something their entire fleet was blind to. A young sailor hurried toward him, thrusting a folder into his hands, the latest radio intercepts compiled overnight. He flipped it open casually at first, scanning the lines of encoded traffic. Then, he froze. A single column of figures, buried midway down the page, contradicted everything the Japanese estimates claimed about American mobilization. Just one number, but one that did not fit any projection Tokyo had endorsed. The cold air suddenly felt thinner. Nagata swallowed hard, staring at the page as if the ink itself had begun to shift. For the first time, he understood that the strike now underway, the strike the Empire believed would define the Pacific, might already be colliding with a reality no one in Tokyo had prepared to face. Lieutenant Nagata Kyōshi had never imagined his life would lead him into the shadowed corridors of naval intelligence. Born in 1911 in a quiet district of Yokohama, he grew up in a house that shook every time a ship's horn echoed across the bay. His father, a shipping clerk, often brought home stories about foreign ports, endless American vessels, warehouses overflowing with goods. Even as a boy, Nagata sensed that behind these tales lay something enormous, an industrial power so vast it felt almost mythical.
But in the Japan of the 1920s, such thoughts were unwelcome. Teachers spoke of spiritual strength conquering material excess. His classmates memorized poems about the divine wind and the destiny of the empire. Kyōshi learned early how to keep his questions hidden. At the Naval Academy, he rose quietly, not through charisma or influence, but through an unsettling precision. While others excelled in gunnery or navigation, Nagata devoured data. He analyzed fleet exercises the way a surgeon studied anatomy, dissecting discrepancies, tracking cause and effect, mapping the invisible currents of miscalculation. His instructors admired his mind, but warned him that the Navy preferred men of action, not thinkers who hesitated when answers grew uncomfortable. Yet in 1937, when Japan plunged into full-scale war in China and manpower was stretched thin, the Navy needed officers who could make sense of numbers, not just fire torpedoes. Nagata was quietly transferred into an analytical department housed in an unremarkable building behind the Imperial Naval Staff. There, amid stacks of reports and fading telegrams, he discovered both his talent and his curse. He could see patterns others ignored. Small inconsistencies, an unexpected American ship commissioning date, a spike in civilian industrial output, contradictions in congressional procurement schedules, all stood out to him like cracks in glass. But whenever he raised cautious concerns, senior officers dismissed him with the same phrase: America is soft, America is slow, America cannot mobilize quickly. Their confidence was ironclad, reinforced by assumptions repeated so often they had hardened into doctrine. Nagata learned to speak carefully. The Navy's culture rewarded obedience and punished uninvited foresight. Many of his colleagues treated analysis as a symbolic gesture, something to justify decisions already made, not something that could challenge them. Intelligence work, in their view, was merely a formality, a ritual to confirm what the admirals already believed. Kyōshi found himself increasingly isolated, the only man in the room who saw the numbers not as decorations on charts, but as warnings the high command refused to hear. And yet, he stayed. Not because he hoped to change the system, he was too realistic for that, but because he believed the truth, even ignored, had to be documented. He filled notebooks with quiet calculations, alternate projections, hypothetical mobilization curves. No one asked for them. No one wanted them. But he could not stop himself. It was as if he sensed that someday these hidden figures would matter more than the confident pronouncements of any admiral. By late 1941, Nagata had risen to the modest rank of lieutenant, technically insignificant, yet invaluable to the handful of analysts who still cared about accuracy. He was meticulous, reserved, unfailingly polite, the kind of officers whose silence made others uneasy because it hinted thoughts they could not control. And beneath that calm exterior lay a growing fear he dared not voice, that Japan was navigating toward a war it fundamentally misunderstood. When the Akagi steamed toward Hawaii, Nagata boarded as liaison from the Intelligence Bureau, tasked with verifying last-minute estimates. It was supposed to be a ceremonial assignment, a symbolic affirmation that all calculations were sound. But as he stood on the cold deck that morning, watching the attack aircraft vanish into the horizon, he felt the weight of every ignored warning pressing against him like an unseen hand. He lowered his eyes to the radio intercept sheet still clutched in his fingers. The number on the page, the one that should not have existed, pulsed in his mind like a distant alarm. Kyōshi understood then that he was no longer just an observer inside a flawed system. He had become the only man aboard who knew that the first cracks in Japan's victory were already visible and widening. Japanese naval intelligence in the late 1930s and early 1940s was a structure built on contradictions, ambitious in appearance, fragile in reality. It occupied a dim, narrow wing of the Naval General Staff Building in Tokyo, where the air always smelled faintly of ink, dust, and damp paper. Officers moved quietly through cramped corridors carrying stacks of reports they seldom read in full. The organization looked orderly from the outside, but beneath its neat uniforms and polished floors lay a system chronically understaffed, undervalued, and dangerously disconnected from the admirals who demanded certainty, not accuracy. It was within this constrained world that Lieutenant Nagata had learned the rules. Intelligence existed not to question strategic doctrine, but to decorate it with plausible numbers. The problem began with status. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, operations officers, the men who planned battles, issued commands, and believed deeply in the samurai spirit, held nearly absolute authority. Intelligence officers, by contrast, were viewed as clerks, necessary but secondary. Many of them were reserved for tasks considered uninspiring, decoding intercepted messages, summarizing foreign newspapers, compiling industrial data that nobody wanted to think about. When analysts produced assessments suggesting American industrial capacity was expanding faster than expected, operational officers would laugh it off, insisting that America's softness of spirit would render those numbers meaningless in wartime. Intellectual caution was dismissed as weakness, and Nagata watched as boldness, not accuracy, became the currency of influence. Budget constraints deepened the rot. Japan had been at war in China since 1937, draining resources that its economy, far smaller than America's, could barely sustain. New ships strained the limits of steel production. Aircraft factories struggled with engine shortages. Yet the intelligence division received even less funding than the Navy's schools or ceremonial units. Basic tools of analysis were outdated. Comparative studies relied on guesses more than data. The United States, with universities feeding expertise into government bureaus, had entire departments producing industrial forecasts. Japan had a handful of officers like Nagata, working late into the night with calculators and foreign magazines, trying to measure the strength of a nation that dwarfed their own. Cultural assumptions forged the final link in this chain of disaster. The Japanese officer corps was steeped in a worldview shaped by decades of victories against China and Russia, victories achieved through determination, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice. Many believed these virtues would compensate for any material disadvantage. Thus, instead of assessing America as America truly was, they assessed America as Japan would behave if placed in America's position. This mirror thinking produced fatal distortions. They assumed the United States would mobilize slowly because Japan would mobilize slowly with such a large population. They assumed Americans would fear casualties because Japanese leaders feared them less. They assumed industrial output could not double in a single year because Japan had never accomplished such a feat. Each assumption became a link in an unbroken chain of errors. Inside the intelligence office, alternative analyses existed, but they remained in drawers, uncirculated, unacknowledged. Nagata had written several himself. One report, drafted in late 1940, warned that the United States could expand its naval personnel by several 100,000 within 2 years if it enacted emergency measures. His division chief returned the paper the next morning, unmarked except for a single sentence scrawled in red ink. Too pessimistic. Recalculate with Japanese standards. Another time, Nagata attempted to include American industrial rate of growth curves in a summary for the Operations Bureau. The graphs were removed before the document reached the admirals. He understood reluctantly that senior leadership did not want projections, they wanted reassurance. Thus, the Japanese war machine marched toward conflict, guided by a map drawn from outdated assumptions and wishful thinking. The intelligence system, hollowed by hierarchy, prejudice, and pride, could not challenge the illusions that came from above. Younger officers like Nagata, who sensed the growing gulf between their calculations and reality, were silenced by a culture that equated doubt with disloyalty. By the time the fleet sailed for Hawaii, the outlines of disaster were already visible, only to the handful of men who spent their nights staring at numbers that refused to align with official doctrine. And on that December morning, as the Pacific winds carried the first echoes of war across the ocean, Lieutenant Nagata held in his hands the newest intercept, a document containing a figure that pierced the heart of all earlier assumptions. A number so large, so wildly beyond Japanese estimates, that even he struggled to believe it. It was the moment he realized the catastrophe was not coming. It had already begun.
The core of Japan's looming disaster lay in one breathtaking miscalculation, a numerical blind spot so immense that it would quietly predetermine the outcome of the Pacific War long before the first torpedo struck Battleship Row. Lieutenant Nagata had suspected the existence of such a flaw for months, but he did not understand its scale until the night before the strike on Pearl Harbor. When he studied the American mobilization estimates approved by the Naval General Staff, he saw neat columns forecasting that the United States could field approximately 300,000 sailors by 1943. That figure had been repeated so often that it became almost sacred within the Navy, a comfortable anchor for strategy, doctrine, and belief. But it was wrong, disastrously wrong, and the evidence was already visible to anyone willing to look beyond the numbers Tokyo preferred. The reality, as confirmed by the American congressional records he had quietly reviewed, was that the United States was capable of mobilizing at a speed Japan could not even conceptualize. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy would not have 300,000 sailors. It would have more than 2.3 million, nearly 8 times Japan's projection. American shipyards, bolstered by mass production techniques and a workforce of millions, were preparing to launch new ship wars at a pace the world had never seen. Aircraft carriers that Japan believed would take years to build could be completed in a fraction of that time. Destroyers, escorts, transports, submarines, all were being produced at rates no Japanese model accounted for. What Tokyo viewed as an American slow giant was in truth an industrial thunderstorm gathering force far beyond the horizon. And it was not only the number of sailors. American vessels carried crews 40 to 50% larger than their Japanese counterparts. A single U.S. carrier task group could field more trained personnel than entire Japanese fleets. Worse, the United States had the industrial depth to train hundreds of thousands of new sailors every single month, even while expanding its army and air force. The Japanese Navy, with its rigid hierarchy and limited training infrastructure, had no means of matching this colossal surge. It was like watching a small dam stand against a rising tide. The structure appeared stable until the water climbed high enough to reveal every crack hidden beneath the surface. Nagata knew the numbers. He had calculated them in secret. Yet each time he attempted to present even a modest warning, senior officers brushed it aside. They argued that the United States lacked the spirit for rapid mobilization. They believed industrial strength meant little without the will to fight. They repeated assurances that Americans, being accustomed to comfort, would avoid mass enlistment and balk at high casualties. These convictions, unsupported by data, hardened into strategic doctrine. Even as the American Congress voted for unprecedented defense budgets, even as shipyards doubled their workforce, even as U.S. factories expanded into entire cities of steel and smoke, the Japanese General Staff clung to a picture of the United States frozen in pre-war slowness. The mathematical consequences were catastrophic. Every Japanese operational plan, from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the Southern Resource Advance to the projected decisive battle, was predicated on the belief that the U.S. Navy's growth would be modest and slow. The entire war strategy assumed a narrow window during which Japan could dominate the Pacific. But with each passing month, that window shrank, then vanished entirely, replaced by a tidal wave of American manpower and machinery that would crush Japan's shrinking pool of trained sailors. The empire was preparing for a boxing match, unaware it was stepping into the ring with a titan capable of growing stronger every time it was struck. Nagata felt the full weight of this truth pressing against him like a tightening vice.
He knew the mistake was not the result of a single flawed report, but of an entire institutional mindset, a collective refusal to acknowledge reality. And now, on the eve of war, the final intercept lying in his hands contained a number so enormous he almost doubted his own eyes. It was the first official confirmation that the United States had mobilized even faster than his own worst-case projections, a figure that would make the approved estimates look like fiction, and one that would shatter everything Japan believed about the coming war.
By the spring of 1943, the war had changed its rhythm. What had begun as a confident, swift march across the Pacific was now slowing beneath the weight of unseen forces. Forces Lieutenant Nagata had warned about, but could never fully quantify. The atmosphere inside the Naval General Staff building in Tokyo had grown taut, filled with murmurs about American counteroffensives, unexpected ship deployments, and unfamiliar radio signatures that hinted at formations larger than anything Japanese analysts had predicted. Yet even as the signs accumulated like storm clouds, the High Command insisted the situation remained under control. Temporary setbacks, the admirals repeated. Fluctuations, not trends. Nagata, watching quietly from the edge of the operations briefing room, felt the same tightening in his chest that he had felt on the deck of Akagi 16 months earlier, the unmistakable sensation of truth being buried beneath pride. On a humid June afternoon, the moment he had feared arrived. A new packet of U.S. naval intelligence, compiled from signal intercepts, captured documents, and Allied press, was brought into the analysis room. The room itself was dim, its wooden walls lined with maps of the Pacific dotted with red and blue pins showing fleet movements. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and tension that had accumulated over months of quiet dread. Senior analysts gathered around the long table as the newest figures were spread out before them. American ship tonnage, personnel movements, aircraft production rates, new training installations. The numbers looked unreal, almost deliberately exaggerated, as though someone had accidentally added zeros. Nagata leaned forward, scanning the documents with practiced precision. He traced a column showing U.S. naval personnel strength, the same category that had once been confidently estimated at 300,000 by Japanese planners. His eyes followed the updated figure slowly, as if bracing for impact. The page read, 1,784,000 active naval personnel as of May 1943, with additional notes projecting an increase to more than 2 million by year-end. The room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before a question, the kind that follows a detonation, a silence in which the weight of an entire nation's misjudgment pressed down on the lungs of every man present. One of the senior captains, an older officer with deep lines across his forehead, set his pen down with a soft, almost fragile motion. "This cannot be correct," he whispered. Another officer flipped through the intercept logs, searching for inconsistencies, errors, anything that could rescue the illusion they had lived under. But there were no mistakes. The data matched multiple independent sources. The Americans had mobilized faster than any military force in history, faster than Nagata's own worst projections, faster than even the most pessimistic Japanese analyst would have dared to say aloud. And then the realization came in a slow, crushing wave. Every Japanese strategy, every projection, every operational expectation, every battle plan had been built on numbers that were not merely optimistic, but delusional. The American fleet Japan believed it could fight and defeat was not the fleet that existed now. That fleet had been replaced by something colossal, expanding across multiple oceans at once. The decisive battle Japanese doctrine had promised was no longer mathematically possible. Japan was not preparing to face a giant. It was standing before an industrial empire whose strength grew larger every day, like a tide that ignored the existence of those who tried to resist it. Nagata felt something inside him collapse. Not panic, but a cold, hollow certainty. The war was lost, not because of Midway, not because of Guadalcanal. Those were symptoms. The cause had been born long before the first shot of the war. In these very rooms, in the quiet dismissal of data, in the arrogance of men who believed spirit could outweigh steel. The door slid open. A rear admiral stepped inside, his face stern, his voice measured. "Seal the reports. These figures are not to be circulated. They will be reviewed later." Nagata watched as the documents, the first honest glimpse of reality, were gathered, bound, and locked inside a reinforced cabinet. Not one word of what he had just seen would reach the fleet. No admiral at sea would know the scale of the enemy bearing down upon them. The truth, so long ignored, would now be buried deliberately. And as the key turned in the lock with a heavy metallic click, Nagata understood the final devastating irony. Japan's defeat would not come from the Americans. It would come from the silence inside this room.
In the months that followed the concealed report, the consequences of Japan's miscalculation unfolded with the cold inevitability of a tide pulling a stranded ship into the deep. Lieutenant Nagata watched from within the quiet halls of the Naval General Staff as American momentum transformed from rumor to reality. By late 1943, U.S. task forces appeared simultaneously in areas Japanese planners had deemed impossible to reinforce at the same time. New aircraft carriers, vessels Japan had believed would take years to complete, were launching every few weeks from American shipyards. Destroyers, escorts, transports, and supply vessels multiplied across the ocean like steel phantoms, each crewed by sailors trained under a system whose scale Japan had never understood. The Pacific, once envisioned as a battlefield Japan could dominate through surprise, had become an expanse filled with the growing hum of American machinery. Nagata saw the shock ripple through command circles. Admirals who had once spoken of the decisive battle with unshakable confidence now stared at maps in heavy silence. Reports from frontline commanders described not isolated U.S. formations, but entire waves of coordinated operations, airstrikes, amphibious landings, submarine assaults, logistical offensives. Instead of a single front, there were 3, then 4, then 5. The Americans were fighting in the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Aleutians, the Central Pacific, and the Southwest Pacific simultaneously. Japan, stretched thin and fighting on exhaustion rather than resources, could not keep pace. Every counterattack drained strength it could not replace. Every island lost exposed another line of supply. Every defeat in the air was multiplied by the simple fact that Japan was losing experienced aviators 3 times faster than it could train replacements. Yet the most devastating blows were invisible. The attrition of time, the suffocating pressure of an enemy whose numbers did not diminish. Japan's shipyards struggled to replace even a handful of destroyers. American yards launched dozens. Japan's pilot training programs took a year. American programs trained thousands per month. Fuel, steel, copper, rubber, Japan rationed each as if bargaining with fate. The United States consumed them as if the war were merely an extension of its industrial rhythm. This imbalance was not a battlefield phenomenon, but a mathematical certainty, a truth Nagata had sensed in the tremor of those early calculations and now saw manifested in every dispatch. By mid-1944, the war's outcome no longer depended on tactics, courage, or brilliant maneuvers. It depended on arithmetic, and the arithmetic had turned irreversible. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through Tokyo, not only because the island was a strategic keystone, but because it forced the Japanese leadership to confront what they had long denied. The American fleet they faced in 1944 was not merely larger than expected. It was beyond comprehension. When Admiral Toyota received the updated American order of battle, he studied it for several minutes, then quietly folded the document and whispered, "This is not a navy. This is a world." Nagata,
still confined to his analytical post, could only watch as the final chapters of the war unfolded with the slow, heavy certainty of a tragedy already written. He saw the desperation in the directives sent to forward units, urging them to hold islands that could no longer be reinforced. He read casualty reports that reflected not only loss of life, but the loss of institutional memory. Thousands of trained specialists gone, replaced by hastily instructed recruits. He watched as the Navy he had devoted his life to began cannibalizing its own foundations. Aircraft built with inferior materials, ships launched half-finished, pilots sent into combat with barely a month of training. In the final months of the war, the truth that had once been locked inside a steel cabinet became painfully, brutally visible. American carriers darkened the horizon with their numbers. Their aircraft filled the sky in waves so thick they resembled weather patterns rather than military formations. Japan's proud battleships, built at staggering national cost, became immobile symbols of a doctrine that no longer mattered. The home islands braced under the weight of bombing raids carried out by aircraft launched from floating airfields Japan could no longer hope to destroy. When the war ended in August 1945, Nagata stood among the ruins of Tokyo, watching columns of smoke rise between shattered buildings. The city around him, once a maze of confident voices and rigid doctrines, had been reduced to ash. Yet what haunted him most was not the devastation itself, but the quiet realization that the empire had not been defeated on the battlefield. It had been defeated long before the first American bomb fell, long before Pearl Harbor, long before the carrier fleets clashed at Midway. It had been defeated in the rooms where truth was unwelcome, where numbers were reshaped to fit belief, where warnings were silenced because they contradicted the desires of men who mistook conviction for strategy. As he walked past the remnants of the Naval General Staff building, now cracked and abandoned, he saw the memory of that locked cabinet, the place where the truth had been sealed away. And he understood, more deeply than ever before, the lesson history would never forget. Wars are not lost when armies fall. They are lost when leaders refuse to see what stands before them.